Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be talking about two very important stories. The first is with reference to the economic situation of the country, which of course we have seen going through a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pressure coming in from international markets, the political scenario at home as well as many other factors which have caused the economic situation to deteriorate over the past few months. We have seen certain improvements in certain factors, but then of course we've also seen the reversal of factors such as the appreciating of the rupee. We also have seen that there have been many measures taken by the government, many calls for a charter of economy, a lot of emphasis being laid on how the economic situation must improve. But again, we have seen that despite the efforts that have been made, there has been slow progress and that we are still trying to stabilize the economy. Of course, there is the expectation and the hope that we will be getting the IMF bailout package as well as other inflow coming in from friendly countries as well, which are going to help improve the situation. And then moving on, the international markets will also ease. Whether or not that actually happens and how exactly it's going to impact the economic situation, of course, remains to be seen. We will also be taking a look at the State Bank's decision of maintaining the policy rate at 15%. And this is something that, of course, has been carried out keeping in mind the requirements of the economic situation of the country. We have seen in the past that this was increased, but now the State Bank has made it clear that they will not be increasing the policy rate beyond 15%. Whether or not factors in the international market in terms of investment in Pakistan or inflation, how are they going to factor in moving on in the future, and how exactly will the policy rate going to impact it? Whether or not the State Bank decides to decrease it, of course, remains to be seen. Even if they have the room, they may not be doing that. We will also be taking a look at what other factors will play regarding the economic evolution in a few months following now, and then of course also in terms of the bailout packages that we're expecting and how they're going to impact the economic situation, and whether or not we will be able to sustain the kind of measures that we require at this moment. So that is going to be our first segment today, taking an entire look at the political situation of the country as well as the impact of the political scenario that is there. There's also, of course, what is going to be our second segment of the show today, the issue of floods and rains that have impacted and devastated major parts of Pakistan since July now. Another factor that, of course, is also impacting the economic situation of the country, but of course a lot of people have lost their lives and many have been displaced. There have been thousands of homes that have been destroyed. Many children and women have lost their lives, unfortunately, due to these tragic floods. And we have also seen that there seems to be no respite coming in from the weather. There have been forecasts of more rain, and so the torrential floods keep on increasing. We've also seen that because of the terrain and because of landslides and increasing floods, the rescue and relief efforts have also been hampered, and there has been a lot of talk with regards to what the Prime Minister and the government of Pakistan have been saying in terms of the kind of help and assistance that is required and the kind of relief and rescue efforts that will be provided to the people, including cash assistance as well, and also outlining an amount going through for the relief efforts as well. They've also called on to the international partners to support Pakistan in this time of need as well. And then, of course, the humanitarian crisis that is there. There's also the longer term disadvantage to the country as well, and the kind of impact it may have if we have a major impact on the agricultural output as well. So that's going to be our second segment of the show today. For this and more, I've been joined in the studios as always by senior analyst Farrukh Pitafi, and we've also been joined by Dr. Khaqan Nadeem, who's a former advisor, Ministry of Finance, and we've also been joined by Syed Javed Hassan, chairperson, Economic Advisory Group. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us in the show today. I'll start with you, Dr. Khaqan. When we take a look at the current economic situation of the country, there's of course talk in the past as well as to how the only options that we have are difficult and tough decisions, and that may be so, but when we talk about the kind of measures that are needed urgently, the kind of impact that the people of Pakistan are already going through, will be going through in the coming months as well, how exactly do you think that the current factors and the current measures taken by the government are playing out? Are we moving towards the correct direction? And then when we talk about the monetary policy, of course, and the State Bank's decision to keep the ceiling at 15% till now, what exactly do you think is going to be the impact of such a decision in terms of the immediate and long-term measures?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sana, thank you for having me on your show, and it's always a pleasure to be on PTV World. So let's look at over the last few months what has happened. I think Pakistan went through a severe credit crunch on the dollar, and it was largely due to the delay in the IMF program. Our supply of dollars diminished, whereas the demand peaked as the imports of petroleum products went up, both in quantity and in terms of the value that we were buying. I think since February, we were trying to complete the seventh review, and then there was a political change, which further delayed the process. And it came to July when we signed the staff level agreement with them. And inshallah, I'm hoping on Monday, Pakistan's $1.17 billion will be approved by the board. So what the delay in the fund does is that it also slows down other creditors' money, whether that's the multilaterals, whether that's the bilaterals, whether that's the commercial facilities. But along with the easing of the constraint that this had kind of placed on our build up of foreign exchange reserves, what obviously happened was that our reserves position dropped to an untenable level of $7.8 billion. That hardly covers over a month of Pakistan's imports, and that's not a good sign. Normally, as policymakers, we would like to think of the coverage to be around 3 months of the imports of a country. All in all, what you saw was this event that took place, and it disturbed the markets. It disturbed Pakistan's credit default swap position. It disturbed Pakistan's position on the euro bond that we were holding. It disturbed the Pakistan's foreign exchange markets in Pakistan. So everything made the investors jittery. But as we've started going back to the fund and other commitments, what you've seen is from the UAE, from Qatar of about $3 billion. And another, today I was listening to the Saudi Arabian commitment of about $1 billion. I think it's in the oil facility. Yeah. So this credit crunch will be eased. And if this credit crunch is eased, in the short term, you have a breather.
All right. Mr. Syed Javed, when we take a look at the current scenario and, of course, the kind of investments earlier that Mr. Khan was also talking about, of course, we're very happy to hear that there is an investment coming in very soon worth $1 billion in Pakistan. And this, of course, is important considering, of course, that we have been looking towards the IMF and other friendly countries for their help in this regard. But what sort of an impact do you think that this current inflow, or when it does come into Pakistan, is going to have on the overall economic situation, and how long do you think it's really going to help us move forward in terms of survival? Of course, again, this is not a sustainable way of supporting the economy.
Thank you very much, Sana, for having me on board on PTV today. I always look forward to this. Just have to say this, obviously, the inflows that are coming in from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates will be critically important at this very difficult juncture. But I don't think that is a long-term viable solution to our problems. One of the things I have to mention is that the State Bank of Pakistan has been dipping into the reserves to pay for the current account deficit. That is worrying. I think that is a practice that needs to be examined. We have to be careful about how we fund our current account deficits. Now, obviously, where there is a shortage of market access because of the credit default swap ratio rates, as well as the international bond rates, we were not able to access international markets as previously we were able to do so. But having said so, we probably should have relied more on market-based mechanisms. We should have looked to tap into the market to buy dollars rather than dip into our reserves, and really allow the markets to operate. If it means the currency has to depreciate, while that is very unpleasant and has inflationary implications, we really should allow those mechanisms to operate without too much state bank intervention. Uh, Really, even using the reserves for current account deficits is effectively state bank intervention, and even more so when you start paying debt for it. So, uh, my one thing is that if we are going to have sustainable, long-term, viable solutions, we really have to rely much more on market-based solutions than simply rely on friends for assistance. This
Right.
assistance is
Right,
extremely
Javed
viable.
Sahab,
It's extremely useful.
this is a very good point. But with due respect, sir, since we are talking about the current situation, let me go back to the basics and ask you, because Dr. Hakan was saying that he is hopeful that on Monday we are going to, IMF is going to approve the loan as well. Let me ask you, but there was this question of financing gap, external financing gap, worth 4 billion. After the announcement from Qatar of $3 billion and $1 billion from Saudi Arabia, are you hopeful that that bottleneck is over? It is no more there, sir?
I am hopeful, but so far the credit default swap premiums have not shrunk too much. It's still well over 15%. Also, the latest Sukuk bond for Pakistan, December 22, was trading at around yield to maturity of about 27, 28%. So we are still not out of the troubled waters, so to speak. I think access to the credit markets internationally remains to be seen if it will open up, because you would have imagined now that it's going to the board, the IMF is just about to extend the facility. You would have imagined that the markets would start discounting these positive developments. It doesn't appear to be the case. There has been some discounting, but it hasn't really come down to a level where we can access international markets. I hope after the 29th that is the case, and you see CDS premiums come down significantly, and also the bond rates to improve significantly. If that happens, we can access international markets. But also, I think we should hope that the pressure on the currency stops, so that the state bank can build its reserves without having to spend money for current account deficits.
Right.
Right.
Farrukh, when we take a look
Yeah.
at the monetary policy, of course, by the state bank and its decision to keep the ceiling of 15%, do you think that if we talk about how there is more inflow coming in the country and perhaps more investment, and if the international markets trends also change, then do you think there's a possibility of any monetary easing by the state bank?
I think there will always be the possibility, because eventually these rates are really high, really high. Hopefully, this is the peak of it, and we are going to see that eventually they are going to come down. But Sana, going back to what exactly is happening at this moment, there is concern that was voiced by SBP as well, and I think every economist will be actually sounding that alarm. At this moment, there are so many variables which seem out of hand. For example, this situation of flooding that we are going to cover in the second segment. Because of that, considerable amount of, sizable property of this country, which was arable land, is underwater now, and crops have been destroyed. Because of Ukraine crisis, there's always the possibility of an imminent, food crisis all over the world. And then the domestic demand might actually shoot up as well, because you have to import. If you do that, what exactly are you going to do then? In that kind of scenario, we have to actually look at a lot of variables, and we have to worry about it. Hopefully, at this moment, this crisis of balance of payment will pass. But eventually, then we have to look at the broader picture. Our actual financing gap over the year was somewhere around $30 billion. And the State Bank of Pakistan has flagged the fact that Pakistan has already acquired commitments worth $37 billion. But what if the demand or the need goes even higher? That becomes a problem. So let us hope in coming days we see kind of seriousness which is needed, because SBP is right, and then the commentary that we have seen also in the papers as well, that there are lobbies, and the moment things start stabilizing, they are going to actually go for the same kind of policies, or they are going to lobby to revert back to the same cyclical policies which have actually brought us to this place.
Absolutely. Dr. Khakan, do you think that when we talk about the current crisis of floods and of course the way that the rains have impacted Pakistan at the moment, of course there's loss of lives and property at the moment, but there's also the longer term impact on the economic situation and even the immediate impact on the economy. Is there any estimate of the impact that the current economy is facing due to this crisis, or do you think there is a need to do that right now, a sort of analysis or estimate of what sort of economic requirements will exist, what sort of agricultural requirements would exist, and then of course because of that consequently supply chain will be of course disrupted. What sort of do you think strategy is needed right now to make sure that when we talk about the economic impact of these floods in months from now, we will be in a position to deal with that?
So, Sana, if I could pick up why we reached this situation and put forth one of the reasons in front of people is that Pakistan clocked its highest fiscal deficit in FY22 of 5,280 billion rupees, which is more than $24 billion. We borrow $7 billion or $6 billion from the IMF, and we are clocking $24.5 billion of fiscal deficit. We are clocking 850 billion rupees of deficit, which I call quasi-fiscal deficit in the electricity sector. So going forward, you've had a breather by borrowing, which is just one way of getting over this hump that we've gotten into. Maintaining your expenditures in the next year so that you're not over this 7.1% of GDP. What we've signed with the fund is 4.9% of GDP, which should be our fiscal deficit. So that kind of leans me into what has now happened with the flood situation. Because our expenditures would tend to go up as we do the spending for the floods. Not only the rescue effort, but then as we move on to the relief effort. In both rescue and relief, as we use the income support program, in which I think we have about 8 million registered households by now, and this is a success of Pakistan's digitization and connecting via the NIC the whole of Pakistan, where we can now identify where we need to target subsidies. So we would need to do that, and that's something we would need to talk to the fund of the expenditure that we would be incurring, and then talk to the multilaterals as well to create some budgetary support. I think we should be also thinking of collecting domestic resource mobilization directly to fund this kind of relief effort. You must remember that the kind of flooding that we are seeing is unprecedented, much stronger than what we saw in 2010. We've lost over 900 lives. 20 million people are displaced. And there are two major crops when we come to discussing the economy, besides the human tragedy that we are seeing, that are in trouble. One is the date crop, but the other one is the crop which is the backbone of Pakistani economy, as I always say, the cotton crop. The cotton crop estimates before the floods were about 8.5 million bales, which are itself short of what we need to feed the local industry. Now with this 15 to 20% more gone, that's my initial estimate as I speak with a number of people before I came on your program. And if we look at 7 million bales, then we would be importing. That would put pressure on the imports and on the expenditures. So the management gets tougher, to answer your question.
Right, Dr. Hakan, I'm glad that you're talking about all these moving parts which are really needed at this moment to be focused at. But the two questions came to my mind. Earlier you were talking about rescue and relief, right? There's a third part to it, that is reconstruction as well. that will also be needed. And one concern that I've got is, why don't we have an estimate of total or maximum loss? And why haven't we actually flagged it internationally by now already? Because NDMA should have put out some kind of alert or demand to the donors as well. Do you think that IFI's their commitment of 8 billion and 9 billion, World Bank and ADB, in case IMF approves the loan, that won't cover it? So do we have a number, tentative number right now?
So that's a very good point. You must remember that once the $1.17 billion, inshallah, gets through on the board on Monday, what that does is that opens us to quicker project financing. There are lots of projects that are in the offing with the World Bank, ADB, and IDB, ITFC, that we can really fast track if we push. Within that, we can create space, and monies are always fungible, and they can be moved on to this reconstruction sort of projects that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And we could convince the international community to come forward. Then there's the bilateral partners, there's European Union, there's FDCO. So all have to gear up. I would be having a conference right now, putting initial estimates and getting initial money. But again, as I say, there are the two other parts to it. One, the people of Pakistan must come to support it this time as well. Within the country, there is enough money, and I think that should come. And the second part is, of course, that, as we used to put, for example, ICRA surcharge for education. I'm off the top of my head. This is the time to contribute towards this kind of an effort.
Surcharges, Dr. Saab, through surcharges, it seems that the common man is already over leveraged, is it not?
Of course. I mean, here we talk about people who can pay this kind of money, and we don't have to do that immediately. But you also have to see there are 30 million people who have been rendered homeless. I mean, that's a huge number. And the casualties, I'm sure, are more than that is being reported, because it's hard to report. So of course, rescue, relief, and reconstruction as we move on. Donor funding, yes. Domestic resource mobilization, I'm more of a domestic resource mobilization person. I still believe that Pakistan's economy is highly under paying lesser tax than what the policy makes it pay. So there is a huge tax gap. And this is the time. If you can't tax your agri sector, on the income side, if you can't tax your trade sector, if you can't tax your wholesale, retail, then you'll be dependent. So on the longer term, we must start thinking about issues of this kind and productivity. One last thing, and then we can move on. 2 episodes of 2018 and 2022 have taught us very clearly. 5% is the speed limit on which the economy tumbles on the balance of payments. That is where we should all put our heads together and sort.
There should be some kind of supper, some kind of dam to stop beyond that. Sana, with your permission, I have a question for Javed Saab as well. Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Javed Saab, regarding the investment announcements that are coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, earlier you can address the issues which were flagged earlier as well. But earlier, since we were talking about borrowing and then somehow these two things got intermingled, at this moment we know that the Saudis are going to invest, and Qatar, QII is also going to invest in Pakistan, particularly in hospitality, airports as well. Do you think that this is a better way to go forward? Because when they invest in infrastructure improves, and then the profitability also improves, and then you don't have to actually go and ask for more loans?
I think investment is always better than loans, because there's a skin in the game of the investing party. I think if you have Qatar and United Emirates investing in our companies, they would want to see an improvement in productivity. PIA is almost a sick company. It needs turning around. If Qataris bring in expertise as well as investment and recapitalize it, there's a greater chance of it turning around and becoming a more profitable company. So as much as the liquidity itself is very important, What is also very important is what expertise, what new management, what further investments, recapitalization that takes place in these companies. If they're looking at the oil exploration companies, which I've heard is being talked about, there's a lot of potential in the oil exploration area in Pakistan. That also can be expanded. So I think as much as the liquidity in itself is important, also the faith that these countries are putting in Pakistan, which is also extremely important, it's also important to see how they will actually bring about a change in the overall structure of these companies, and from them being a burden on the exchequer
Right.
every
Mr.
year.
Javed, you talked about, of course, these countries putting in faith in Pakistan as well. And of course, we want more investment and there needs to be more efforts regarding that. But considering the current economic situation and the way things are going, also in the political domain, and how the international markets are also going forward, do you really think that at this point in time, Pakistan can attract more investment coming in? Of course, there is some amount of money coming in from different countries. But when we talk about the investments in terms of business growth within the country, of course, we need that to happen on a much larger scale for it to impact the economy significantly. Are we in a position to do that right now?
Look, I think obviously Pakistan offers rock bottom valuation, so there's an attraction in some of the listed companies. Having said that, there needs to be a lot of structural change in Pakistan. The economy needs to open up, tariffs need to come down. It really, instead of going up, which is being talked about, we really need to be much more integrated with the rest of the world. We need to have be part of the global value chain. All of that needs to happen. But in reality, we need to first stabilize the economy. All of these good things will happen, hopefully, in the next few years. But before we can talk about all these structural change and fundamentally important structural change that needs to happen, we need to be in a position where we're not from day to day struggling for liquidity and facing default. That is fundamentally
right. But again,
important.
Mr. Javed, of course, when we talk about structural change, this is not something new. We've been talking about this for a while now, and we don't seem any closer to that. And it seems to be a huge challenge. Do we have time enough?
I think, if
yes,
I may,
go ahead.
Dr. Najib pointed out a very good point. We were doing quite well. I think in the previous government, we were arriving at 3.5%, 4% GDP growth. It was, even if we had not given the 2021 stimulus, we would have achieved about 4.5%, 5% GDP growth. I think that we made a great mistake when we started actually extending the turf program. We actually gave a stimulus, and that led to this sort of expansion in growth, which was quite unnecessary. That in turn led to higher imports, which in turn led to the erosion of our reserves, which has come home to us all now. So really, I think the point is that Pakistan is a balance of payments constrained economy. Dr. Najib is very generous when he says 5%. I think that 5% has come about because of an increase in remittances. But in reality, there are a number of studies that suggest 4.5%, 4 to 4.5%. That's debatable. But, this sort of obsession that we need to have 6% GDP growth when our structural condition in the country doesn't allow, our productivity is not that level, we really should not be thinking in terms of growth. Really, I am one of those economists who actually believe that there should be no talk about growth. What should be talked about is productivity, the overall structures in the economy. And once those things are in place, growth happens automatically. Trying to focus on a top line number when you have the underlying conditions not in place, that tends to be the problem. And it's worse to have 1 year 5% growth and then followed by 3 years of 2% growth, which has often been the case in Pakistan. So I think there has to be some kind of political wisdom where politicians focus much more on the underlying condition in the country. And these underlying conditions have been for far too long ignored. I think a point which again Dr. Najib alluded to.
Javed, let me also compliment you for something very pithy that you actually pointed out earlier. You said that regarding liquidity and investment, you said that, we have, at least this is what I gathered from it, we have the habit of confusing the, means and the ends. In the end, it seems that we keep on debating about the means as the ends. And that is important to remember, that the actual interest is in investment and internal growth or infrastructure development. That doesn't seem to be happening. And we have to look at that. Let me actually go to, with your permission, Dr. Hakan, Sana,
Yes.
with your permission to Dr. Hakan. Sir, at this moment when we are looking at the state of affairs, we keep on, talking about growth, and then we have to actually see that we are also perhaps a victim of middle income gap, middle income trap, that we keep on actually trying to actually export everything instead of catering to the local market. And on the other side, when we try to export, we end up importing more. So in the end, there is going to be a balance of payment crisis in coming days as well. Is there a way to actually balance this out and to ensure that our growth is not at the cost of our foreign currency reserves?
So that's a very important point, but I'm going to just digress for a moment and answer one of Sana's earlier points. Javed Saab did it, but I want to allude a bit more. I think this is time for Pakistan to come up and do a transaction so that in the international market, we can say that we did AUG TCL, or we did one of the airports, or we did 3 of the airports. This proposal is not new. I was on the table in 2018 when the Qataris came. They wanted to take the 3 airports, take the managerial control, but we were not able to. So we have to ensure that we have the
why were we
wherewithal.
not able to? Can you explain
Because
that?
one of the reasons is that now you have that G2G
Agreement.
empowering legislation that you didn't have at the time.
Okay.
And then, of course, our system clogs these kinds of proposals, right? Our system doesn't have the wherewithal, whether that's our Board of Investment, whether that's our Privatization Commission, to do the necessary homework, to do the kind of evaluations that we need to do, and then the administrative system, and then the overhang of the.
Sorry to cut you again, sir, because I keep on hearing these very heavy words. Let me ask you to pass them a little. Are you referring to the bureaucratic red tape in this country?
So I'm talking to the administrative clog, but that also had an overhang of the watchdogs that were doing it, and the bureaucracy itself, whatever capacity it had, was not able to execute that. And then, of course, there is a shortfall of the competency of the professional setup. These are high-value transactions. You need investment bankers, you need smart people who've done mergers and acquisitions abroad, who've done investment banking to be able to complete such transactions. The valuations matter. So all in all put together, we were not able to do so. And this is not a blame on anyone, whether the leaderships or this is the reality of our system. But this time we must ensure that we show the world, whether it's OGDCL, whether it's SUI North, whether it's PIA, whether it's the airports, whether it's the LNG power plants. So now I've put a menu in front of you. I was very keen that we should have sold the LNG power plants. They were unencumbered. They right now have 104 billion rupees in terms of circular debt. It makes me bleed. My heart bleeds when I see that figure. But we have to move on. The Qataris have the LNG. I would have done the LNG power plants long time ago, maybe $2, $3, $4 billion. And that's a transaction must be put in Pakistan, must come on the international map and say that we did this transaction and we did it successfully. It didn't go to the courts. It didn't become a record or whatever. So and now coming to your second point, look, you have to remember, I know imports are touted a lot, that we have very high imports, and we do about 25% of GDP. But the problem is you have those imports, a lot of which are used to do the exports because you're using the raw material and the inputs that are coming in. But your export level of 10% of GDP is abysmal. That's the real issue. So yes, you want to curb imports. For me, to curb imports is not a good idea. But I want to substitute only one import, and I'm not talking about import substitution, is that my agri-productivity of the country must go up so that I don't need to import a couple of $1 billion of wheat or cotton. And if I can do that, lentils and edible oil, that's not import substitution, that's increasing my agri-productivity. Again, the word productivity is something.
Once again, Dr. Saab, great point made at an awful time. At this moment, I don't know how we can actually jack up our agricultural production, not at least this year, right? Most of the crops seem to have been destroyed. But regarding what Javed Saab was saying earlier, the way we actually started fighting over whatever commitments were made regarding CPEC at that time, it seems that we actually start, nitpicking the first low-hanging fruits rather than actually playing the long game and focusing on the long-term interest. At this moment, the biggest concern, and I understand agriculture is a part of it, but when you talk about the common man on the street, do you see that the Pakistani industry is catering to his need as well? It seems that somehow we keep on emphasizing on exports, but our own market might be captured by other countries eventually.
Can I intervene here?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
I think this is quite. We have a fascination with this business of we should not allow imports and our markets. One of the worst things we have is all these protective barriers for industries like auto and quite a few others, I might say. Frankly speaking, I see no reason why a Pakistani should pay 3 times more than what anyone else pays anywhere else in the world for a pretty useless car. And what we do by creating these very protected markets for our locally, supposedly local produce products, is that we actually dissuade them from exporting abroad. So you create an anti-export bias. So you know really we should. I know it's easily talked about and it feels intuitively right that we should try and cut down imports. Again, look at Vietnam. Its imports to GDP something like 104%, but it also has an exports something like 109%. So the point is, countries which actually are integrated with the rest of the world, they tend to have a much larger part of their economy which are imports.
Right,
So what you
absolutely.
don't
Unfortunately, Mr. Javed, I'll have to cut you there. We're almost out of time. But thank you very much, Dr. Khaqan and Mr. Javed, for joining us. We have very less time to talk about a very important issue, which is the floods, of course, that have been impacting Pakistan for a very long time. And this is something that is unprecedented, as we were discussing in the previous segment as well. And it has its economic impacts. But of course, the real tragedy also exists in terms of the humanitarian crisis that is going on at the moment. We've lost many of our fellow brothers and sisters in these floods, and of course we've seen millions of them being displaced, and a lot of the relief and rescue efforts that is underway at the moment is also being impacted by more rains and more floods. Farrukh, of course there have been various measures announced by the government. They have talked about how they are going to set aside a number of funds to help the victims of these floods, and then of course there's cash assistance as well, but there's also calls that have been made to various other countries in terms of asking them to also contribute and to help Pakistan at this time of need. When we talk about the situation at the moment and the fact that we're expecting more rain, more floods, and that the rescue and relief operations might even be hampered even more so, how is it that Pakistan will be able to deal with this, and how much do you think the international contribution at this moment will be significant?
Right, absolutely, Sana. First of all, we'll have to put a number to it, right? At this moment, we are still looking at a devastation which continues. So first of all, we'll have to assess how much we need, and then we can actually put out the request for help to IMF, to the UN system. Actually, Pakistan has flagged this matter through the UN system already, and I'm sure that we will be hearing from the UN side as well and all other countries. But first of all, let us talk about the domestic state of affairs. The government, of course, is focusing on cash handouts, those who have been displaced. And by the way, let us just wrap our head around the number of people who have been displaced, who don't have any roof on their head, and that is 20 to 30 million. That is 2 to 3 crore, which is not a small number, right? Pakistan's total population is 210 million. So in that situation, just think the kind of devastation we are looking at. And this is the initial, estimate. It can, God forbid, it can go further higher. At that moment, the government of Pakistan has actually focused on cash handouts, other measures as well, rescue and relief as well. Then we have heard that BPS 17 and other government servants above that are going to, contribute their 5 day salary. And then we heard that our army is also chipping in. Our general officers are actually giving away their 1 month salary. That is very encouraging. But while this goes on and people who are in power and people who are actually serving this nation are contributing already, although they are salaried people, the indifference at this moment that we have seen coming from the elite, and I mean economic elite of the country, is staggering. Because as I pointed out the other day, the media's coverage of it, we had to actually literally wake them up. 50 channels not looking at this. They all were obsessed with one man, Shehbaz Gill, right? And after that also, while political parties, especially those who are out of power but popular and populist, they keep on agitating about things which are perhaps imaginary. The parties that we don't actually pay that much attention to, for example, TLP and Jamaat-e-Islami, they have actually organized their own caravans and they are actually helping people out. In that state of affairs, do you think any political party, no matter how populist, will survive this kind of pressure? I don't think so. Right now, it is important for everybody to wake up and realize that we haven't seen this kind of devastation even in 2010. Our Minister for Climate Change, Sharif Rahman, was speaking to the media today, and she actually pointed out that in 2010, although the amount of water in the river system was higher, but it was only one bank of the river which was flooded. This time, both banks are flooded. So just think. Actually go to the Twitter timeline at this moment, your Twitter timeline, and look at the people who are putting out the videos. A child is standing halfway through in water and he's actually, giving azan, calling to God to help out. When does that happen? When the elites, when the rich people of the society stop paying attention. There seems to be a disconnect which is growing every second minute. That shouldn't be the case.
Absolutely. Farrukh, of course, we keep saying and hearing that this is something unprecedented. And of course, it may be so with regards to the amount of destruction that we have seen. But again, when we talk about floods, that is not something new to Pakistan. And we have had floods in the past as well. And perhaps every year there is a risk of having such destruction. Is there any way that you think that this particular destruction or the scale of destruction could have been prevented?
Right, and Sana, this is quite an interesting chain of argument actually. When one is sitting under a roof and it starts collapsing, the first thing is to actually extricate yourself out of that building and ensure that you have some roof over your head to sleep, right? At this moment, the state is so urgent, the state of affairs is so serious that first we have to look at what we need to do with the people who are suffering. Then we can take stock of what went wrong, and then of course we can have an audit of who actually did could have done and should have done but did not do. At this moment, the argument is simple. When you talk about our river system, there are places where you have the drainage system and there are places where you don't. Those people who were sitting next to the river and they didn't have any safeguards have been inundated and their houses have been destroyed. So you'll have to have a long-term plan regarding fixing this problem. But right now, honestly, we don't have the luxury of time to actually debate this.
I get that. And of course, there is that urgency and that requirement that is there. And we really hope that everybody in Pakistan can contribute and help as they've done in the past in the case of such disasters. And we hope that the suffering ends soon and that relief and rescue operations continue along with the support by the government of Pakistan and other countries around the world as well as the people of the country. But there's, of course, much that needs to be done in terms of taking a look at what can be done if we need to prevent such crisis in Pakistan, perhaps later, but it is due and we hope we can do that. Thank you. That's all from the debate. We'll see you tomorrow.